Hello and welcome to today's discussion on the topic, the Ukraine crisis and the future of NATO. And to do that, we have three experts who look at different dimensions of NATO and other related subjects. The ongoing war between Ukraine and Russia has put a spotlight on NATO, its expansion, its usefulness, and its relevance. These debates have continued both in the realms of conventional security as well as nuclear security in Eastern Europe particularly and the rest of Europe generally. When NATO's founding members signed the North Atlantic Treaty on April 4th, 1949, they declared themselves, quote unquote, resolved to unite their efforts to collective defense and for preservation for peace and security. The greatest threat to these objectives was, of course, always a military attack by a hostile power, a prospect that has come true now, and which has seen the possible invocation of Article 5, which states that the parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. Now, NATO has been a cornerstone of security in Europe and of the United States foreign policy for over 6 decades. But its ability to continue to play such central role is unclear, especially in circumstances that we are faced with today. In this context, I would like to ask certain questions to the panelists today to be able to assess how does the future of NATO look and what are the circumstances under which NATO is operating right now, what are the pressure points, and how does the future look like. With that, let me just invite our first panelist, Rachel Rizzo from the Atlantic Council, to make a sense of what does she think on the question of what is the future of NATO in the backdrop of the ongoing Ukrainian crisis. Over to you, Rachel.
Great. Well, first, I just want to say thank you so much for the invitation. And second, we're recording this on April 4th, 2022, which of course is the anniversary of NATO's founding. It was the day in Washington, D.C. in 1949 that the Washington Treaty was signed by NATO's 12 founding members. So I feel like this is an apt celebration and way to mark the 73rd anniversary of the alliance. So first, I think to really make sense of where this crisis, what this crisis means for NATO and where it's going, I think it's helpful to look back at some history and how we got here and why the alliance is the way it is today and the role that it plays. I want to start by saying that I think what we've seen over the last month with Russia's invasion of Ukraine is in the process of being one of the most significant geopolitical events since the end of the Cold War. I think it's going to fundamentally reshape how we think about the world order that has underpinned the global system for the last 30 years. What this looks like, we're not sure yet, but I think it is in the process of being of looking, I think, fundamentally different in a way. For NATO, I think it's helpful to look back a little bit at the U.S. approach to Europe at the end of the Cold War, because I think that sets us up well to look at where the alliance is today. When you think of where the alliance was at the end of the Cold War, there were a few goals that the United States wanted to push forward. Right. First was that we wanted to integrate the former Warsaw Pact countries into the West to ensure the continuation of U.S. presence on the European continent. And given the dissolution of the Soviet threat, we also wanted to dissuade Europeans from building their own European pillar of defense within Europe, because then we would run the risk of NATO not just becoming irrelevant, but actually dissolving. So from the get-go, for the last 30 years, it's been very important for the United States to ensure a continued presence on the European continent. Fast forwarding back to today, I think there are a few moments that have been marked since the beginning of the invasion that I think will fundamentally shape how NATO acts going forward. First, you saw just a few weeks ago the tripling. Well, the first time that the alliance has deployed the very high readiness joint task force, which is this 5,000 strong ready group of a spearhead force that can deploy in just a couple of days. This force is really interesting because it's led on a rotational basis by different countries. So France is the one leading it right now. And for the very first time in a collective security response in the alliance's history, that task force that's part of NATO's broader response force was deployed to NATO's eastern flank, which I think goes to show that the alliance is very serious about not just reinforcing deterrence on the eastern flank, but also reassuring Eastern allies that have been, questioning what Putin's moves might be next. What's interesting about how NATO has responded over the last little while is that it was sort of born, the mechanisms that it's utilizing today were born out of Putin's 2014 illegal annexation of Crimea, right? You had the 2014 creation of Enhanced Forward Presence, which are multinational battalions that are in Poland and the 3 Baltic countries. You had the creation of the Rapid Action Plan, which was agreed to at the 2014 Wales Summit, which basically launched the most significant reinforcement of NATO's collective defense since the end of the Cold War. So NATO, I think, has been preparing for this moment for the last 8 years, and it's in a really good position to reinforce deterrence on the Eastern Front. Now, of course, because of the 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act, which was a mutual collective agreement that was signed by NATO and Russia, there is some discussion about whether or not the alliance can have permanent forces stationed in former Warsaw Pact countries. So the troops that NATO does have on the eastern flank are on a rotational basis rather than permanent. But there is a discussion right now on whether or not that presence will be permanent going forward. I think NATO has shown incredible unity over the last month. You saw President Biden on his second trip to Europe for an extraordinary NATO summit just a couple weeks ago. And the bilateral support that NATO countries have been showing Ukraine, sending weapons, sending kit, helmets, aid packages, I think has been really important. Those bilateral agreements or those bilateral aid packages, I think, are in a way a little bit more important to look at because the NATO alliance as a whole is sort of hamstrung as to how it can respond as an alliance to what's going on in Ukraine. So I've been looking really closely at what countries are doing bilaterally. What this means for NATO going forward, I think there are a couple things. I think this has focused the alliance in a way that it hasn't been for years. Again, going back to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the threat that NATO faced dissolved. And I think for 30 years since then, NATO has been not necessarily struggling to find a purpose, but it's had to consistently reinvent itself. We've seen out of area operations, we've seen training, we saw ISAF in Afghanistan. But I think what this Russian invasion does is refocus the alliance and makes it understand that Russia is the main thing that it should be focusing on. Of course, later this year in Madrid, there's going to be a new strategic concept that's announced, which is basically the guiding document that will lead the alliance in terms of its priorities for the next 10 years. There's a lot of discussion about the role that China would play in that strategic concept. But I do think if we look at what's happened over the last couple of months, there's probably there's perhaps some rewriting going to refocus the strategic concept on the immediate threat, which is Russia. The second thing that I think has happened over the last couple of months, which is significant, is that this invasion, it has woken up Europe. For many years, the United States has tried to push our European allies to spend more on defense, to take more responsibility for the security of their own neighborhood. And I think it's unfortunate that it took a Russian invasion of Ukraine to do that. But I do think that Europeans are at a point where they understand how important it is to spend more on defense, to have militaries that are ready and trained. And if anything, I believe that over the last couple of months, that is what this invasion has done. It's refocused NATO in a way that it hasn't been for 30 years, and it's created a situation where Europe understands how important it is to spend a significant amount of money, not just on defense, but on securing the European neighborhood. So I will go ahead and leave it at that and send it back over to you guys. Thanks.
Thank you, Rachel. I will come back to you on some of the points you've made and go deeper into them. But before that, let me go on to Dr. Sethi. Welcome, ma'am. So, we would like to get your views on what does the current crisis between Ukraine and Russia mean for not just NATO, but the European security in terms of, and because you are an expert who looks at the nuclear dimension of it, you're free to analyze it from that point, but also broaden it for our perspective from different angles. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Vivek, and thank you to the Observer Research Foundation for having me share my thoughts on this very important subject of the Ukraine crisis and the future of NATO. In fact, the thoughts for all of us, I think, are still evolving as the crisis is evolving itself. But to start, Rachel pointed out the Washington Treaty and how we are commemorating, the start of NATO today. And I remember in 1989, with the breakup of the USSR, there were a series of articles which appeared talking about the relevance of NATO now that the threat that it was supposed to counter had suddenly dissolved. And NATO was making a case to say that there is still a relevance for us, and here we are. And very rightly, as Rachel pointed out, I think what this conflict has done is reinvigorated this alliance in a way that we haven't seen since 1989. So the Russian action in Ukraine has brought a unity to the nations. They realize the strength that comes from that unity. And I think in the context of the emerging belligerent actions, behavior, language by China, this unity of action is going to be seen by NATO to be extremely important. And I completely agree with her that the transatlantic alliance and European security is beginning to reorient itself, to look at itself from a new point of relevance, from the threat perceptions that they have from both Russia and from China in the future. In fact, I remember a NATO meeting just a year ago, which had a very different worldview and a very different sense of what they were meant for, actually. Not all NATO countries were convinced of the need to stick together or even invest in complementary capabilities, not just nuclear, but also conventional, that they, as she pointed out, the investment in the budgetary requirements of that capability enhancement was something that not everybody was on the same page on. And we suddenly find that realization has dawned. Germany, for instance, which has held back for so long to modernize the aircraft for nuclear delivery, has now decided to go ahead and do that. So from the nuclear perspective, I find that this episode, this conflict, is likely to reinforce the necessity of nuclear sharing. Some NATO countries in the past have spoken about withdrawal of the nuclear weapons on their territory. They wanted the US to take it back. I think that is going to fade out. That kind of talk is going to fade out. And in fact, countries would want the nuclear weapons to remain in Europe and with the countries that already have them. So overall, there is a greater salience of nuclear weapons that I find in national security, which is going to come. And this will, in fact, also be reflected in the nuclear deterrence posture review of NATO, which is going to take place later this year. And the likelihood that NATO would accept anything like a no first use, which had also been spoken about for some period of time, I think seems to have again faded out for the time being. All of this can be attributed to the fact that Putin has, invoked the nuclear threat in a rather explicit, unambiguous, clear manner, which was not expected in fact, every time a crisis in our region, in South Asia, between India and Pakistan would happen, we would find that this is where people would say the nuclear flashpoint lies. And suddenly you have a nuclear flashpoint now in Europe, and it is showing the manner in which Putin is making these nuclear noises. We've seen he's conducted nuclear exercises pre-invasion, which he said were pre-scheduled. We've seen the announcement of raising of the nuclear alert level on the fourth day of conflict, which is so early in conflict, actually. And we've seen similar behavior from Pakistan in our own region, where it likes to draw attention to its nuclear weapons the moment a crisis breaks out as a result of a terrorist activity in India, and the chances of a response from India begin to be spoken about. We've seen deployment of nuclear bombers, Russian nuclear bombers in Venezuela. We know that the SSBNs are out at sea from the Northern Fleet. And so repeatedly, there have been attempts to draw attention to the nuclear capability and to the nuclear status of the country by President Putin. Now, all of this seems to be in line with the stated nuclear doctrine that Russia has, which is to say that we want to stop the US or NATO from stepping into or expanding the conventional conflict. So it is to deter the possibility of that engagement, of US or NATO engagement in support of Ukraine, which would be more overt, that Russia is trying to deter by the kind of nuclear signaling that we see coming our way. And given that Russia has what is known as an escalate to de-escalate strategy, where it is suggesting that I would escalate by the use of tactical nuclear weapons. We all know Russia has around 2,000, 1,900 tactical nuclear weapons. So what he's suggesting is that I would escalate this a little bit to that level in order to de-escalate the larger conflict. So in my view then, as a result of all of this that we are seeing in the nuclear domain, we will see a larger impact of the stock value of nuclear weapons going up in general in national security. The most popular view that seems to be gaining ground is that if a country has nuclear weapons, it can act with impunity against another country, and especially if it's a non-nuclear country. And that's what Russia's behavior seems to be signaling. So nuclear weapons that can then be used as a shield to carry out conventional aggression or proxy wars. And this, as I said, has given a shot in the arm to the stock value of nuclear weapons. Former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe said that Japan should look at nuclear weapons for its own protection. We have prominent voices in South Korea talk about having nuclear weapons. So the concerns of this kind being projected now by the non-nuclear weapon states will show up, I think, in the NPT review conference, which will take place in August 22. Lastly, I think the aspect of nuclear disarmament also will take a hit. There are some people who are suggesting that the risk will make people realize the need for getting to elimination of nuclear weapons. But I think equally a case can be made that the desire to have nuclear weapons for national security could push us away from nuclear disarmament. I don't see the NATO nuclear deterrence posture review talking about nuclear disarmament in any way. I mean, we seem to have brought forth the threat perception of attack, which was not seen, even 40 days ago, when the conflict had not yet started, that some country could actually do a land invasion of this kind in today's time. All of this has contributed to raising the salience of nuclear weapons rather than taking them away. If you remember, Vivek, we started this year with the P5 statement, which suggested that a nuclear war cannot be won and should not be fought. And the P5 came together in a united attempt to show that nuclear weapons should be phased out over a period of time. that suddenly seems to have dissipated. There is no optimism on any value of such statements for the time being. So we don't see any arms control or strategic stability stocks on the anvil. And I think NATO, in the context of how it's going to look at nuclear weapons, is going to see the importance of having them as part of that transatlantic alliance once again, unfortunately. But I'll stop here and look forward to more questions.
Thank you, ma'am. While we are at it, I'll take two quick views from you before I move on to Monish. I'm glad you brought the point about rearmament of the world, in a sense. Japan and Germany in the midst of Europe. What is the possibility of these countries actually moving towards nuclear option, particularly Germany? And uh, in the context of the conflict, why do you think the United, and Rachel, I'll probably get your views on this too. Why do you think the United States actually played it down when the nuclear security alert was given by the Russian on the fourth day?
So, very quickly, to answer your first question about whether Germany could move to a nuclear option, no, I don't think Germany will move towards developing nuclear weapons. In fact, as we are all aware, Germany has been wanting to give up its nuclear energy program as well. They wanted it to finish in 2022, but because of the vulnerabilities of oil and gas that have shown up, their dependence on Russia, they are going a little slow on phasing out nuclear power for the time being. But given that there are American weapons there in Germany, I don't see them wanting those to be removed in a hurry from their territory, something that they had been talking about in the past. So it will remain under the NATO umbrella, the extended deterrence of the US, but generally feel reassured when the weapons remain with them. As far as your second question about why did US downplay the threat, I think the US is being ultra careful uh, to not seem to take any actions that would ratchet up the nuclear threat. In fact, a scheduled ICBM test, which the US was going to conduct during this period, I think after a week of when the conflict actually started, they decided not to carry that out so that there would be no chance of misperception by Russia. Also, as part of the newly announced, U.S. defense strategy and their budgetary actions on the nuclear plans that they have, they've decided to shelve the submarine-launched cruise missile. Again, something that was, feared to lend itself to misperception. So, U.S. and NATO, I think, have indicated that they do not want to widen the scope of this conflict. They want to avoid military contact directly, for sure, so that it would remove the reason for Putin to in any form try to use the nuclear weapon first. So they're being careful that they don't get sucked into a conflict, that they stay away from the red lines as they perceive them as far as Russia has, because the stakes certainly for Russia are far higher than what they are for US and NATO, and they don't want to get into any kind of a conflict, especially not a nuclear conflict. And that's, I think, why they have downplayed that threat and not risen to the bait sent out from President Putin.
Thank you, ma'am. I'll come back to you with more questions, but let me move on to our third panelist, Monish Tourangbam. Dr. Monish teaches at Amity. Thank you for making it despite being under the weather. So, Monish, your initial thoughts on how do you look at the current crisis, and what does it look like for NATO and for Asia overall?
Thank you, Vivek, for the invitation. Thank you to Observer Research Foundation. Thank you to my co-panelists. Good evening to Dr. Sethi and good morning to Rachel. Not to repeat what Rachel and Dr. Sethi has already pointed out about the genesis of NATO and all those things related to that, but to sort of jump quickly to sort of add to some of the points which were raised before. Just like to point out that it's quite interesting that this crisis sort of comes for America at two very definite junctures, which is that it comes, at a time when much of the Trump administration, and then even before that, the whole debate was there about what's going to happen to this relationship between US and NATO, right? The debate was about the fissures and the fault lines in this relationship. You had Trump going to the NATO headquarters and sort of taking everyone to task about expenditures and all those stuffs. And this crisis, so to say, has come at a time which has brought, as I think Rachel pointed out, a kind of purpose, a kind of direction to NATO as an organization, and also to this relationship between US and its NATO partners in the Euro-Atlantic theater. That is one. The other point, I think, is that this crisis comes right on the close on the heels of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. And I think this is important because the only time the Article 5 of NATO gets invoked is after 9/11 attacks, right? So that's kind of interesting that the NATO that was founded for defense and security of the European theater, Article 5 was actually invoked for Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. And I think it comes at a time when a lot of questions was being raised about US as a security guarantor at large for its NATO partners and as well for partners in the Indo-Pacific, right? So in that sense, I think it does bring together NATO, gives it a sense of purpose, gives it a sense of direction, but raises a different question for me as a scholar of US politics, which is that uh, does that sort of bring NATO as an organization, which is a threat-induced alliance, right? Does it need a threat after all to bring it together as an alliance in the first place, right? Because after the end of Cold War, when you did not find a purpose for NATO, you tried finding other directions for NATO and democratization of the post-Soviet space, and all of that came into the picture, and the enlargement/expansion of NATO, and why it was necessary, and this whole debate about whether NATO was really a value-based alliance, values-based alliance which had a purpose beyond just countering the Soviet Union in finding a purpose for itself. And and in all this, you found some kind of a political wilderness, a purposeless sense for NATO, and now you finally find a purpose, and that purpose comes from a military threat. That purpose comes from a military crisis. So is NATO, after all, then a crisis-induced, a threat-induced alliance, right? Which really needs the invocation of a near-term threat in order to put itself alive, right? And I think this aligns pretty well with a lot of other organizations which went moribund and irrelevant after the end of Cold War. I'll just give you an example. There was something called the US United States Information Agency, USIA, which handled much of the US public diplomacy propaganda stuffs against the Soviet Union in the entirety of the Cold War. And suddenly, after the Cold War, the Congress was no longer interested in USIA being there. USIA went out of the picture. And then it took 9/11 attacks to bring back American diplomacy back again and say, well, there's a threat out there of a different kind, and we need public diplomacy. And the end of Cold War and the end of one threat doesn't mean that we sort of disband everything. So that is one particular question that I bring up for the panel, which is that does it after all bring NATO forward as a threat-induced and crisis-induced alliance? Does it need a crisis and a threat after all? Second point, is about the future of Europe and its relationship with NATO and European Union, and the European Union's common and security defense policy. What is going to happen to that? Because apart from what Rachel spoke about, Europe finding its part in terms of whatever the Americans have been telling them about, greater burden sharing, or picking up the slack in terms of expenditure and all those things. What I gather from my European peers is also a different direction of sense of finding strategic autonomy for Europe. Europe's own sense of strategic autonomy. In terms of saying that when European Union was founded, it Europeans sort of came forward and said that, well, we found this ingenious answer to the perennial question of international relations, which is how to prevent wars. And I said, okay, we found this answer. Okay, European Union is the way to prevent wars. And then everyone around the world, including the ASEAN, the SAARC, every organization, what is sold in the world said, look at this organization. This is the city upon the hill. We need to look at the European Union and learn from what the European Union has done. And it is the way to prevent wars. And now you have this crisis, and suddenly there's this question hanging over the European Union. Did we really find an answer to this perennial question of international relations? And what does it tell about our own defense and security and our own sense of relevance of the US as a security guarantor? Then this brings me to my last question to tie up, which is that while we discuss the future of NATO from New Delhi sitting here, I think the question for us is not really the future of NATO, but the future of America's relationship with its non-NATO partners. I think that's really the crux of the question. What is going to happen, because it raises a lot of questions about mutual expectations. What are we expecting from each other? I think this crisis has pulled up this question that the US-India relationship, despite all the bonhomie, hasn't really matured in the way that we thought it had. And I think the visit of the Deputy National Security Advisor just opened up this question of, did US diplomacy learn its lessons from the past? That in New Delhi, people do not buy open lecturing very well, right? The kind of messages that were passed across during Deputy NSA's visit, some of them could have been done in private, right? I think it brings again this whole idea of how to deal with these two democracies, which have shared practices as democracies, but which have very different civilizational way of dealing with negotiation in a very different way. So I think it really brings up this question for me, that this, besides the question about the future of NATO, it is really a question about how US deals with its non-NATO partners in this new threat environment. I'll leave it at that. Maybe when the questions come, I'll get back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Monish. Let me pick on your last question and move to Rachel and ask her on, so much of the effort that the United States has made towards consolidating a European response to the Russian aggression has also come out in terms of strains on Asian partners, particularly India. Many wouldn't call them strains, but there are signs of not being on the same page for the United States and India. So in terms of the consolidation of European response and European Union and NATO, what impact will it have on America's Asian partners, particularly in the Indo-Pacific? And how does it reshape America's response to China, which is, again, another front that Jens Stoltenberg, NATO's Secretary General, has often talked about, that NATO strategy has to be divided between Russia and China. So, Rachel?
Sure. So I think something that's very interesting about the way that Biden has approached his foreign policy since he entered office has been, he looks at the world in sort of two spheres, right? It is an existential struggle between democracy and authoritarianism. He has used this line over and over and over again. The first time he did so was in a joint address to a joint session of Congress, maybe a month after he came into office. So right off the bat, he has laid the foundation that this is what we are fighting for. Democracies need to deliver. We need to show that a democratic way of governance can deliver for its people. And I think that's why the president has pushed Europeans so hard, especially in the response to the Russian invasion. He's pushed NATO unity. He's pushed unity on sanctions. If we're going to, speaking of sanctions, these aren't meant to be, I think, a deterrence measure at this point, but they're supposed to be more medium and to long-term punitive measures. So he's used this framework, I think, to create a sense of solidarity amongst the democracies of the West, right? I think this can be problematic for a few reasons. but it's thus far worked. I think what this means for the relationship between the United States and our Asian partners is that the rebalance to the Indo-Pacific region that was really started under Obama and that shocked the Europeans, and not in a good way, Biden is continuing this. I think this administration still views the pacing threat or the pacing strategic challenge for the United States as China. They understand that Russia is an acute threat, but they don't view what's happening in Ukraine as something that will fundamentally change the outlook of the United States, which is that we need to focus on the Indo-Pacific region, which is why I think the response that we're going to get from this administration is going to be one of pushing Europeans to take more responsibility for the security situation in their own neighborhood. I think what we're going to see and what we're already seeing emerge in the United States from this crisis is sort of two factions, right? You have folks on one side who have in some cases worked on NATO enlargement in the 90s, who have been part of this broader long-term story of transatlantic relations, and who look at Russia's invasion of Ukraine and say, see, we've told you that this was going to happen for 30 years. This means that we need to double down on US forces in Europe, recommit US presence, have potentially permanent presence on NATO's Eastern Front. So this faction of people who say this is going to refocus us to the transatlantic alliance. At the same time, and in tandem, you have another group that says we can't let this distract us from the broader issue here, which is the long-term strategic challenge that China poses. I think both of these are problematic in some ways. I think the right answer is somewhere in the middle, where the United States doesn't decrease our presence in Europe right now, but we simultaneously push the Europeans to take more responsibility, to spend more on defense, and support them when they undergo projects that would allow them to further integrate their defense, their not necessarily their forces, but their defense efforts, while we simultaneously continue to rebalance to the Indo-Pacific.
Thank you. I would quickly follow up with a short question on something that you've written about, which is the issue of cohesion and capacity, both, but particularly cohesion of NATO, and the issue that many have talked about within the NATO, which is one of erosion of democracy, and particularly countries with examples of Turkey and Hungary, and now Hungary, Viktor Orban winning another term. How do you see NATO keeping these countries, particularly Turkey and Hungary, intact on their agenda?
So there are a couple things here. This question of cohesion really gets to the heart of what NATO is as an organization. Is it a defensive military alliance, or is it a much broader group of individual countries that are defending democratic values? And some people, people have different answers to that question, right? But the reason that this is important, the reason that the question of what NATO is important, is because it's a consensus-based organization. Every decision that NATO makes at the level of the North Atlantic Council, which is its highest decision-making body, has to be made by every member, which is 30 at this point. One member saying no to, say, a new member or military, some sort of military action can derail the whole thing. And so you have to make sure that internal cohesion is something that you focus on, because if you don't, then bilateral issues that are between countries within the NATO alliance can end up bubbling to the surface and creating cracks and fissures that people like Putin like to see. The other reason it's important is because, if you can't fundamentally agree on what the alliance is defending, then the founding documents, Article 5, this idea that an attack against one is an attack against all, this mutual defense clause. I think they're not rendered meaningless, but it becomes difficult, I think, for countries to agree on what they're defending when values start to divide so starkly from one another, which I think we're seeing a little bit in places like Hungary and Turkey sometimes. I also think it's important for political will. You can spend all the money that you want on defense, on a ready military, but if the political will is not there to utilize your assets and your materiel, then it sort of becomes a situation where they sit there and collect dust, right? So I think this is why we have to have serious discussions about NATO cohesion and the importance of leaving bilateral issues outside of the alliance and working for the greater good of European security.
Thank you, Rachel. Dr. Sethi, in the fog of war actually covered most of the nuclear safeguards issue. The Chernobyl incident, Russians being exposed to the radiations and going back from there. How does this war, and where does this war leave the nuclear security safeguards, both in Ukraine, and what happens to the facilities in Ukraine if Russia captures them or leaves them behind?
Thanks, Vivek. Interesting question. And in fact, it's for the first time that we are, talking about nuclear security from the dimension of what happens to nuclear power infrastructure and facilities when they are in a war zone. Normally, nuclear security has been seen as theft or sabotage or activity by non-state actors that could, lead to risks in nuclear power plants. But today, this conflict has brought to light the fact that Ukraine has 15 nuclear reactors, that, Zaporizhia, which has the largest number of reactors in Europe, came under threat by the Russian action. There was a projectile that fell on an ancillary unit, leading to a fire over there. Thankfully, it was just, a sidelined unit and not really the main reactor or the command and control center. But this is the dimension that has come out as a result of what we are seeing here. The International Atomic Energy Agency, as you know, which is responsible for the safeguarding of these reactors, as well as the spent fuel pool, which is existing in Chernobyl after the meltdown of that reactor. The DG of the IAEA has expressed concern about how those safeguards will continue when you're in a war-torn zone. But he visited Ukraine just about, I think, a week ago. And he has recently come out with a statement to say that some kind of an arrangement has been made with both Russia and Ukraine to make sure that no accidents of any kind will happen. But nevertheless, the possibility of inadvertently hitting any of these infrastructure which is there, leading to any kind of a radiation incident. And the important point here is that since nuclear sentiment on nuclear energy is so fragile across the world, any incident of this kind tends to have an impact on the acceptance of nuclear energy as part of the energy mix. And this is a concern that India too has. Because while we have an ambitious nuclear power program, it can be unsettled when public sentiment goes against nuclear power, and something like that can happen when such infrastructure gets hit in war-torn zones. Fortunately, I think India and Pakistan have a lesson here to offer in terms of the non-attack agreement that we have on nuclear facilities. You all remember that on the 1st of January, we exchanged lists which identify the nuclear power facilities, the civilian nuclear facilities in both the countries. And the non-attack agreement has, sustained itself despite the political relationship often not being very good. So this might actually act as a template for other countries which could get into such conflicts, that you could have some kind of bilateral arrangements where you make the utmost effort to ensure that no aspect of military fighting, the physical use of military weaponry, would affect the civilian infrastructure in any way. Of course, inadvertent incidents can happen, but that's one way of avoiding such possibilities in the future. So again, the region which was called the nuclear flashpoint for so long might have some lessons to offer to the rest of the world on how these issues can actually be handled.
Thank you, ma'am. Just another quick question uh, on the current situation of the war. Russia seems to be going back, while there are different other versions of it. Some people believe that its troops might be regrouping to attack Kyiv and other places again. In that light, do you see nuclear security coming up again, nuclear threat, particularly from Russia, coming up again as a threat, particularly in the light of the fact that NATO has played it down?
Well, given that nuclear threat making or nuclear brinksmanship is part of nuclear strategy of Russia, I wouldn't be surprised if they draw attention to nuclear weapons once again in order to achieve some political objective that they want to get to. But I think it's highly unlikely that deliberate, premeditated, thought out use of nuclear weapons by President Putin could take place, because I don't see him finding it very easy to find the right target which would send the message. If that target was going to be in Ukraine, then Ukraine is a non nuclear weapon state. It is under negative security assurances that it should not be attacked by a nuclear weapon state. In fact, not many people remember that in 2013, China had offered extended deterrence commitments. For the first time, they said that we would come to Ukraine's rescue if there was ever going to be a nuclear attack upon that country. And therefore, if Russia was to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, it is going to bring itself into some kind of a conflict with China, which is its biggest ally and friend at this moment in time. And if Russia decided to use the nuclear weapon outside Ukraine in any of the other, European countries, then of course the wrath of a nuclear NATO is going to be upon them. So there is no military utility of nuclear weapons that it seems evident, where Putin could come out looking better after having used the nuclear weapon. However, the fear of an inadvertent nuclear use, stumbling into nuclear war because of inadvertence, miscalculation, misperception, I think that threat, that risk should not be ruled out. Because of the ratcheting up of tensions, because of, as you mentioned, the fog of war, because of forces being on high alert levels, the chances of something happening inadvertently remains extremely high, and that's really the risk that one needs to be worried about, and which is why US and NATO have tried to downplay the nuclear dimension of this conflict and say that we are just not interested in any of this.
Thank you, ma'am. Finally, let me draw both Monish and Rachel's views on what does the crisis mean for the Indo-Pacific as a strategy. Starting with you, Monish, we saw that this year the Biden administration brought out the Indo-Pacific policy, and there's a clear mention of attempts being made to, or at least the intention of bridging the transatlantic with the Indo-Pacific. Now, if there are two ways how that plays out. One is, of course, that it actually happens, which is distant. The second is that it gradually, the United States tries to push the agendas, converge the agendas between transatlantic, of the transatlantic and the Indo-Pacific. Given that situation, how do you see the relevance of NATO and NATO members for Asia and particularly the Indo-Pacific?
Okay, thank you for the fantastic question, Vivek. Uh, well, let me sort of pull it out from from this thing that uh, ever since the Indo-Pacific debate started, there's another sort of parallel debate that we have been having, which is this idea of an Asian NATO or something, right? And then a lot of like things being pulled up as what would be the framework of such a thing if it were to be there. And now, over a period of time, sort of having uh, NATO partner countries coming up with their own Indo-Pacific strategies, and the European Union itself coming up with its own Indo-Pacific strategy. So I think we have had an sort of an evolving sense of like what could be or what would be, for example, the sharing of partnership or the sharing of capabilities and the sharing of like zones of as you say, which ones to take care of. And I think that this crisis, more than ever before, sort of, I think, throws open this question all the more in terms of like how are this sharing of capabilities and sharing of responsibilities really going to look like. And there's something that I've always sort of thought of, which is when we do divide the Indo-Pacific into sub-theaters, which then will sort of starkly bring in this idea of Indo-Pacific in the maritime sense and Indo-Pacific in the continental sense, right? So, what we can expect from each other in terms of crisis response and all those kind of things, because at a moment when you are having this debate about India's response to the Ukraine crisis, you have a lot of commentaries coming up in terms of like how the West responded or how the West would respond to an India-China border conflict or China's transgression on the Indian border. So I think there's a lot of questions still to be unearthed and answered about mutual expectations from each other regarding how this partnership with non-NATO partners in the Indo-Pacific is going to look like, and do non-NATO
Karan,
partners
Karan,
really
can you
have
please mute yourself?
any role, for instance, in the Euro-Atlantic theater in terms of like you have a lot of countries like India having stakes in what plays out in Ukraine crisis, but stakes are different from influence. So a lot of Indian commentaries are to the point that we are responding in terms of the stakes involved in the Ukraine crisis, and we do not have much of an influence in terms of shaping how the ground situation actually takes place in Ukraine. My last point is, again, because this is something that I study for my bread and butter, so I would just take 1 minute for this, which is that, and I feel intensely about this because for the last 9 years or so, I have been teaching students in my classroom, and this crisis and the kind of debates that you are having with uh, you know students of different age groups in the classroom opens up so many questions to me as a researcher and as a teacher, which is that there was a time before the crisis happened with China threat sort of looming large, when I entered a classroom and it was very easy to find this quote of like an India-US partnership happening in the class, right? And then suddenly with this crisis, I entered a classroom and I find that quote missing somewhere. And I find that suddenly, half of the classroom and more than half of the classroom don't seem to buy this. Okay, they a lot of us seem to immediately buy the humanitarian crisis of it, right? But I don't see the condemnation of Russia sort of thing being bought in the class so easily. And I think this is really important for people who are sitting down and making policies for India and US partnerships, because there was a time, Dr. Shetty is here, when the 1998 nuclear test happened, and it was like, well, India has tested, but that sort of time led to confidence building, starting with the Jaswant Singh Talbot talks, leading up to whatever we had in terms of the civilian nuclear program. Will this crisis provide a certain kind of wake up call for India US partnership? What we need to do, and what are the things which are to be taken with a pinch of salt, and we wake up and say that, well, these are things that we need to work on. Because despite all of the democracy convergence, despite of the values convergence, India and US are partners and all those things. When you have a crisis like this, and when you enter a classroom and you do not find that quote about India US partnership immediately sparking in front of me, I see that there is an image problem for the United States in India, and we need to work on that. That's my thank you.
Thank you, Monish. Thank you. So let me put that question to Rachel. This whole crisis between Ukraine and Russia, and the uh, attempt to consolidate a united response by the US, has what has it meant for the US-India relations? Of course, we've seen some statements here and there. How do you assess that question?
So first, I want to pick up on one thing that Monish said. I've also done a lot of writing and research on how younger people, especially in the United States and Europe, look at foreign policy. And there is a increasingly decreasing view that we are in a continued unipolar moment. It seems like younger people understand that whatever the US was leading over the last 30 years is now breaking up into a sort of multipolar world. And what that looks like, I think we're not sure yet, but I completely agree. It's going to be really interesting to see how the United States, and if the United States is able to shift our foreign policy and our worldview to meet that moment. In terms of the United States and the Indo-Pacific, like I said before, I mean, we're going to continue to push this region as the sort of strategic focus of this administration, when we're going to continue the rebalance that started, 8 or 10 years ago. I think how relevant NATO remains depends on how Europeans step up to the plate, right? I think that, as I mentioned before, NATO has sort of NATO has struggled to find not necessarily meaning, but a focus over the last 30 years. And I think this invasion gives it that focus again. But if the alliance continues to push itself in the direction where it has to also focus on the Indo-Pacific region, I think we're going to have a problem. I don't think NATO is the best organization suited to Indo-Pacific security concerns. I think we're going to see the United States be much tougher on Europe in terms of China, and we are going to, and that's going to be, I think, in terms of economics and political inroads to the European continent. You saw the Biden administration right before they came into office. Germany at the EU level pushed through the comprehensive agreement on investment between the European Union and China, much to the chagrin of Biden and his top advisors, right? Now that agreement hasn't been ratified. It's on ice. I don't see it getting ratified anytime soon. But I do think we're going to see the United States be much tougher on the European Union in terms of the Chinese technologies they allow on the European continent, the Belt and Road Initiative, the Digital Silk Road. We're going to see the United States push the European Union to support countries like Lithuania, who find themselves in a bilateral trade spat with China. And all this, I think, is to serve our broader vision of China as the strategic challenge of our time.
Thank you, Rachel. I think I agree with most of the points you made just now. There has been this talk about excessive focus on China leading to a lack of deterrence in the European continent. I don't want to go into the details of it, but I think that the United States is going to follow a twin policy of Indo-Pacific in this part of the world and the NATO leading its strategy in Europe. I'm also skeptic of their attempts to bridge the two. But the question on militarization of the Indo-Pacific strategy remains open. That depends on how China plays its cards. But before I end, let me invite Dr. Sethi on her last words. Ma'am.
Thank you very much. I, in fact, was provoked into speaking a little bit again at the end by a couple of remarks that were made by Monish. I think I really enjoyed the conversation from both of you, Rachel and Monish. But just to respond to what Monish made this rather passionate plea about how the students are reacting in the classroom. My answer to that is welcome to the real world. Because not everything goes as per what we read in the textbooks. And actually, these students are lucky to be living at a particular moment in time when you're seeing history being made in a certain sense once again. This point about whether US and India are on the same page, can they be on the same page on this conflict? Well, the fact of the matter is that we inhabit different geographies. India is somewhere and the US is somewhere really far away. Both of us have different threat perceptions. Both of us have different relationships with other countries that we are dealing with, and both of us have different national interests and different priorities. Now, when the national interests seem to converge, we come together, and when the national interests are disparate, we seem to be not on the same page. But I think that's why India was never keen on an alliance with the US, because what we want is breathing space, given the kind of differences because of our geographies, etc., which are normally naturally created. And while someone said that the relationship is not mature enough to give us that space, I think this incident has shown that there is a certain level of maturity, that this space is allowed to each other. That America does understand what our compulsions are with Russia, why we have to behave in a certain manner, and similarly, Russia, I think, has also shown that maturity, that there is only far that we can go in terms of supporting the action that it has undertaken. So this strategic autonomy that India has so zealously defended over a period of time, I think, has shown its wisdom again and again, rather than falling into any kind of an alliance relationship with either side. So I'll end here, but it's been a very interesting conversation, and thank you, Vivek, for making it so.
Thank you, ma'am. With that explainer, I think that's the befitting note to end with. And I think, like you said, a breathing space is a great part. Is wonderful for any relationship. So, with that, Rachel, Monish, and Dr. Sethi, please thank you for making time for this.
Thank you.
I had many more questions, particularly on China, which we couldn't touch. But perhaps we'll get back to you at some point in time as this crisis evolves. So thank you so much, and good morning and good evening.